Hi guys, Swift here again with Baileywiki talking about 3D Canvas. In the last video, we got 3D Canvas installed in a Foundry world and got it activated. Today, we're going to go over the simplest way to actually start using 3D Canvas, which is taking your already existing 2D scenes and using them in 3D. So, here we are in a normal 2D scene. We've got a map in the background, we've got walls set up, as normal, and we've got some lights too. I've brought in a few blank tokens to represent players, and put some NPC tokens down to show how vision works. Vision-wise, I've also given these tokens 15 feet of dark vision, just to make showing the fog of war working a bit easier. So, say we want to give this map a little bit of 3D magic. How would we do that? Well, 3D Canvas has added this toggle 3D mode button over here, so if we click that, then we'll find ourselves here in the 3D view, looking down at our map. That's a good start, but there's a few more steps we'll need to take to make this look presentable. First of all, if we right-click on our scene, go into Configure, and then this will all be as normal, and this all works as you would expect, but there's a new tab over here, 3D Canvas, and this tab here contains all the options that do anything to do with the 3D view. On the General tab, there's a few settings you'll probably want to tweak while we're here, enabling the 3D view for the players, and then enabling 3D on load will mean that when someone comes to this scene, they go straight into the 3D view, which is possibly handy, depending on what you're doing. The others are generally up for your preference, we'll look at those later on. And for now, I'm just leaving everything as default. So if we go over to Visibility, and we uncheck Render Walls and Render Doors, what that'll do is hide all the default Foundry walls and doors. So if we hit Save Changes, then the map is immediately looking quite a lot cleaner. And for basic functionality, we're kind of done. If I select this token here, for example, you can see that the fog of war is working as expected. Parts of the map are being revealed as the token moves around. Tokens are being revealed as well as they come into or out of view. So just as it would work in 2D. And if I look at this token here, you can also see that the normal Foundry doors are symbolized by the usual symbol down on the floor, and you can click it to open and close it, or lock it with right click, as a DM at least. And the doors will behave as normal. If you try to move a token through a closed door, it won't work, but then if you open the door with a click, then you can just walk right through. So, like I said, in theory, you could just stop here and run a session just like this. 2D token art is automatically converted into Standees. For example, if I just put some art on this token here, then by default it turns into something like this, which is a sort of 2D stand-up, or a standee, if you would use a real physical version of this. And this otherwise works just like a normal map. We'll go into tokens in a bit more detail in the next video, since they're going to be an important part of any session, and they deserve their own video for that. But as for the map itself, there's a good chance you'll want to enhance things a bit further. So let's have a little look into that just now. Before I do though, for performance, a quick note. Something I like to do with 3D Canvas is I go into the settings menu, and then go into the settings menu for 3D Canvas specifically. And then down at the bottom here, there's a resolution multiplier slider. I'm running this on a 1440p monitor, so I set the resolution multiplier to 0.75, and that basically means that 3D Canvas renders at 1080p. So it still looks fine, but I get a kind of much smoother experience. There's less kind of sluggishness from it. So if anybody's running 3D Canvas on a large monitor, I definitely suggest turning down the resolution scale. Or if you're just on a slower or weaker PC, or maybe if you just think it should be a bit smoother, then give that a try. Other than that, the most important thing performance-wise is to try and use a Chromium-based browser for running 3D Canvas. For some reason, Firefox has really bad performance, which is annoying for me because Firefox is my main browser. But I got the Ripper 93's VTT client, which is an application specifically for playing Foundry, and that works great. In this case, I'm just running this on Chrome though. Anyway, onto the map. Let's have a look around this place. So there's a lot of things you could change, and it mostly kind of depends on the vibe you're going for, assuming you want to change what it looks like. Personally, I think the two easiest ways to set the place up that work for the most scenes is to make it either look like you're at an actual tabletop, that you're all playing a game around, or to make the background kind of match the map you're on. Making the map look like an actual tabletop is pretty simple. The first thing to do would be to go into the map settings in the 3D canvas part, go into the environment settings and disable the padding area, which is this stuff off the map here. If we set that from infinite map to none, then it disappears and is now just an infinite sky. Then if we open up the prop browser, which is on this 3D canvas control panel here, is the little tree prop browser. If you click it, and that'll open up the asset browser or the prop browser, whichever. I will note that the first time you open the prop browser will be really slow, but subsequent times will be a lot faster. Anyway, for this example, let's have a search for table, and we get a bunch of tables, as we can see. Let's pick one we like. I kind of like this one with the metal banding on it. And then if we drag that into the scene, we get it here. Let's stick it roughly in the middle. This control thing here is what pops up in the kind of introductory tutorial. It shows you how to move things around. You basically just click and drag these arrows and it will move things. Let's move it into roughly the center of the screen, and then let's press S to switch to scale mode. Grab this bit in the middle and then just scale it up. Scroll out of it. Let's use R to rotate it and spin it around. Go back to S to scale it some more. Scale it up. Let's use T to go back to translate. And let's stick it under the map. So that's a good start. We've got the map on a literal table, which is a pretty cool look. But needs a little bit more, I think. The sky is a little bit odd. So I think the next step for this would be to change the skybox. Any sort of panoramic image will work for this. If you go into configure, go into the 3D, then environment, there's a box for the skybox. And so basically, if you look online for 360-degree panorama photos of anywhere, basically, you can slot those in here, and then that will replace the sky that you see by default. So I went ahead and got one. Let me just pop that in there. And I went and got a photo of a attic, which I think is a perfect place for having a bit of gaming. Things are looking a little bit dark though. Something that you might want to tweak when you create a scene is if you go into lighting. By default, automatic lighting is set to sync exposure with scene darkness. But since the lighting in 3D looks quite different to the lighting in 2D, you might end up with situations where it's too dark or too light. So I generally turn the automatic lighting off and then just set it on a scene-by-scene basis. Let's put the exposure to 1. There we go. It's a bit more normal looking there. So we end up with this pretty neat effect, a literal virtual tabletop. You could put more effort into the surrounding props, of course, decorate the place up real nice. Something I've done before was putting the map on a table in a tavern the party was in, so that the entire environment was in 3D. That was quite a cool effect, though was maybe a little bit extra. If you happen to be a 3D artist yourself, I'd definitely suggest giving that a try sometime. You get some pretty interesting effects. But yeah, from here, the only thing to do, I would say, is to tweak the lighting a bit. Like if we go into the scene settings again, go into lighting. First of all, you'll probably notice on some scenes you get weird banding artifacts, like we see over here on the left on the table, around about the place, or if we just zoom in real close, we can kind of see lines. That's due to the shadow bias. So what I tend to do is just replace that 18 at the end with a 5, save the changes, and then if we turn 3D mode off and then on again, that just fixes that. Anyway, we'll go back into there. Go back into the lighting. So in the lighting page here, this is mostly the controls for the sun, and the two things you'll want to fiddle with are the time of day, which will move the sun back and forth, and the sun tilt, which will move the sun, well, north or south, basically. Basically, this changes what direction you want the shadows to go in. Worth noting, by the way, the sun position, like all these lights and shadows here, that doesn't actually affect the in-scene lighting, so like character vision. If I select this token here, you can see that he can still only see 15 feet around him. Can still only see things within his vision and all that. It's more just kind of like what that area looks like. A few kind of important places for the sun. If you want very minimal shadows, but with coloured light, you can set the tilt to 0 and the time to 12, and then all the shadows will be straight down. If you want no shadows whatsoever, you set the time of day to 24, or 0, then you'll completely remove sun-cast shadows from the map entirely. If I set this back to something like this, the sun will come back up, there we go. If you want things to be a little brighter or a little darker, then there's the exposure setting, which will just brighten or darken the scene respectively. I'd say you'll probably want to stick close to 1, maybe within 0.3 or so, like down to 0.7 up to 1.3, because if you go too far in one direction, then things just start looking a bit too bright or too dark, but depends on the scene, of course. The other thing you can do is tint the scene, which is actually tinting the light that's coming off the sun. Right now it's just white, so everything just looks as it is. But I think since we've got this background here, and we've got this attic, which is absolutely covered in all this panelled wood, I think if we give the light a bit of a slightly orange cast to it, let's see if that improves things somewhat. So if I go into scene tint, let's have a look. Sort of reddish orange in here, maybe a bit brighter, there we go. Maybe hit save changes. I think that's improved things somewhat. So that's the first way I personally like to set up scenes, to kind of make it more like an actual virtual tabletop that you're all around. And you can use your standard 2D maps, but in 3D, you've got your 3D minis, and everything's working exactly as it would normally, fog of war and all. So you can just slap this onto any scene you like. The second way I like to set up scenes like this is to kind of try and simulate where the map is. So in this case, we're underground in a dungeon. So I feel like the surroundings of the map should look like we're kind of underground in a dungeon. The easy way to do that is if we go into configure here, back into the environment section, is to enable some fog. And what that'll do is that will basically change the color of the skybox to whatever you set this to, and then fade out the map at a given distance. So if we set the fog color to black, and we set the fog distance to, say, 7,000, because we're not really using it to hide anything, if we hit save changes, then we've got a very dark scene all of a sudden. If we select our table and remove it, then we've got our map in the void. It looks a little bit odd for the DM, because we've got this very sharp edge of where the map is, of course. But if you select a token and see the player's vision, then suddenly it's merging in perfectly with the background. So we've got this dungeon in the void, so to speak. There is a slight line at the very edge of the map, though, that you can just about see. I think in situations like this, it's a pretty easy fix. What I like to do is basically hide it with a tile. I'll do that just now. If you go into the tile controls and then place a tile, you can basically just click and drag anywhere and that will just create a tile. So if I click and drag along here, say, if I use my scroll wheel to make it a little bit larger, if I just drag it out there, then we'll just create a sort of blank cuboid by default, which is more or less what I want. If I select this here, and if I just kind of like stick it in the middle, use scale to stretch it out a little bit, yeah, that's good. Shrink it down a little bit, don't really need it to be that big. And then if I put this tile right on the edge of the map, and if I move it down a little bit, just so that it's covering the edge here, I want it to be, reasonably solid. And then if we double click on it to open up the configuration for this tile, go into the 3D section, go into material, we set the tint to black, set the roughness to full and the reflectivity to full, and update. Then we've just got a matte black cuboid. So if we select our token again, you can see that it nicely covers the edge of the map from that angle. I think makes things look a little bit more immersive. So you would just move that around. Something you can do with tiles, if you hold Control and move it, then you'll actually create a duplicate of it. So let's take this map here, move it over here, rotate it in place, and then scale it up a bit we go back in and select our token, there we go. Seamless from the edge of the fog of war into the mist of the black. Excellent for our spooky dungeon adventure. And again, same as before, this could be a stopping point for you. This is a pretty excellent way to run sessions, I've found. Since there's very little actual 3D stuff going on as well, the most graphically demanding thing in this scene is the map that you were already using. So this should be about as demanding on your player's computers as the map itself. Though, as I mentioned before, definitely recommend using a Chromium-based browser or Ripper's VTT client for it, because Firefox does have a few issues with it. One last little tweak for this particular setup though, our lighting. We've tweaked the sun in the scene to change the shadows and the colour of the light, so let's do that again. We've already mentioned that the sun doesn't actually change the lighting in the scene, so despite the fact that there is a bright light source in the scene, it's still not going to affect what tokens can see. So we're just doing this to make it look nicer, basically. If you go over to lighting, something I like to do for underground scenes is, because a shadow on a token kind of does imply a light from overhead coming down, that's not quite sensible for underground. So if we set the time to 12 and the tilt to 0, so we got the shadows straight down. If we set the scene tint to something like a kind of dark blue, and if we set the exposure down to, say, 0.75 and hit save changes, then we end up with a kind of much more dark, undergroundy type situation here with the lighting. Though, speaking of lighting, I should probably go into a bit more detail with the light in a scene. Like if we look over here, this room's a little bit more complex, so it's easier to visualize. So 2D lights will interact with the 3D scene as you'd expect. Like for example, if I go into the lighting layer, where we'll see the spheres for these lights instead of the circles, and if we right click to turn these two off, so that in this room the only light source is this candle in the corner, and then select it there. If we move this token around, you'll see things like the shadows moving as expected, the map getting uncovered as it explores, and areas that have been explored but are still in darkness being covered in this shadowy kind of style. And these lights here are just normal lights that were already on the map in the 2D mode. So if we go back to 2D mode, go to lighting, this is just a normal light sat here in the room. Go back to 3D mode. And what that means is that if you've got a scene that already has lights set up, you don't need to do any further work to get it working correctly. The main difference I'd say is that in 3D, there's not really a clear line between areas of dim light and areas of bright light. Like if we go over to this token over here that's in the darkness, and instead of having dark vision on him, if we give him a light source of, say, dim 15 feet, bright 5 feet, then you can definitely see that there is bright light near him and dim light further away, but there's not really a hard line. So it's more difficult to be precise with it if you're using a system that needs precision on what's in dim light, what's in bright light, etc. If it is particularly important for an encounter, something you can do in the 3D settings is use an aura. So if I give this guy a 5-foot aura to match his 5 feet of bright light, then that'll show a circle around him that shows where the bright light ends. And then of course you can do things like colour it to be more kind of torch coloured. But if you don't really need the precision, then it doesn't really matter as much. One last thing before we wrap up though. This here is just a normal map that's like one big image with walls on it and then lights on it, which is, a lot of maps are set up that way. But a lot of maps are like the bloody halls over here. Let's go over to that scene. And this is a map from the Baileywiki compendiums, and it is made up of a lot of tiles, individual objects all laid on top of each other. And it works fine if we drag in a PC here, we select them, we've got Fog of War going on, as you would expect. But if we go into 3D view, and then disable the walls and doors, then you can see that that's not quite right. And what's basically happening here is that 3D Canvas is getting a bit confused what to show, because all of these tiles and the background are at the same height as far as it's concerned. So it tries to render things and it gets a bit confused and it's not a good time. There's two main ways to fix this. If your scene only has 1 or 2 tiles that are causing problems, then you can just select a tile and then drag it upwards slightly, and that will fix it for that specific tile. But if you've got a whole scene made of tiles, then there's the Ripper93's Media Optimizer module, which is, it's on the Bazaar or in the module installation menu, and it creates a new button in the tiles menu called Tile Combiner. So the way to use that to fix this issue, first of all, make a backup of your scene. Always do that before you're going to be changing things. And then if we click on the Tile Combiner, that'll open up a window here. And it'll tell you, this will make permanent changes to the scene, so always make a backup. And you can choose here whether you want to combine just the background tiles, just the foreground tiles, only the selected tiles, or all of them. And for a map like this, where the whole map is made of tiles, you'll probably want to go for all of them. But the important thing with all of them is if you have any tiles that move, those will also get flattened. So you'll want to do things like select these blade trap tokens that are moving and remove them, and then re-add them after you've done this. Anyway, once you've got all that squared away, if we set the combine mode for this map to all tiles, we want to include the background because we want this map to be made of tiles. If you set your folder path to semi-convenient Forge users, you'll want to put it in the Forge Assets section, and then tick delete combined tiles. Hit combine when you're done, and then yep. And when it's done loading, you might end up with a black scene or similar. This seems to happen a lot. If you just give it a quick refresh, so in this case I'm literally just going to hit F5, and if you come into the scene and it's still just black, then what you'll want to do is go into the configuration for your scene, and then set the background image to the tile that you just created, and then just save changes. Otherwise, sometimes you need to tell it, yep, use that image. There we go. And then if we go into 3D mode with this, you can see here, we have everything showing up correctly. No flickering going on, except for all the flickering of the lights, of course. And then if we just double check that we have Fog of War enabled, yep, and select this token, you can see we've got the Fog of War. Let's give this guy a 40-foot light. And then have a look around. Yep, all working well. Drag him over here. Excellent stuff. So if you've got a map that's mostly made of tiles, then that'd be the way to sort that out. Anyway, I think that about wraps things up for using 2D maps in 3D. We've gone through enabling the 3D mode, looked over how the 3D view interacts with the 2D one, and gone over a few ways to improve the look and feel of your scene easily. There is of course more you can do, more features you can use to spice things up even more, and of course there are fully 3D scenes to look at, but for a thorough walkthrough of the basics, I think that covers everything. The next video in the series will be one about tokens, more details on what options are available and how to set them up. And the one after that will be about fully 3D scenes. As ever, comments, questions or requests are heartily encouraged down in the comments below or in our Discord. And I'll see you all in the next one.